Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first Nuclear Counterproliferation workshop here at the Deterrence Summit. We weren't sure how many people we would get when Brian and I first talked about this several months ago, but clearly we've got standing room only, and I understand that we've got a waiting list for this as well. So thank you again for being here. When Brian DeAndre and I first talked about this, he told me that he felt that nuclear counterproliferation was a subject that was not well represented here, at least historically, in the Deterrence Summit. And he felt that it probably needed some more publicity, it needed some more discussion. Not having ever attended the Deterrence Summit before, I told him that I kind of had the same impression in terms of across the U.S. government. Nuclear counterproliferation is not a subject that I believe is well understood by many in the government. Having worked both as a flag officer in SOCOM and as a program director for nuclear counterproliferation at Los Alamos, I can tell you that even if you were to walk the hallways of Los Alamos, I think, and asked staff members the difference, for example, between nuclear counterproliferation and nonproliferation, I don't think they could answer it correctly. So Brian suggested that we hold this workshop, and of course what followed was, Doug, would you put it together? And so I said yes, I'd be willing to do that, but since we have 3 hours, no one's interested in hearing me talk for 3 hours, so I invited some subject matter experts. So joining us this morning are Jay Tilden, who is the Associate Administrator for NCP, Nuclear Counterproliferation, and NCT, Nuclear Counterterrorism, and the head of NA80, and also 3 senior representatives from the weapons laboratories, Doug Bruder from Sandia National Lab, Andy Erickson from Los Alamos, and Brad Wallen from Lawrence Livermore. They will comprise a panel which we'll bring up after I'm done speaking, and they'll talk about their perspectives on this subject area. But I didn't want the focus to be completely on NNSA, where I felt we needed to bring another agency into this discussion. And so, not surprisingly, I turned to SOCOM, where I used to work, but SOCOM is a good organization to speak to this subject because not only have they historically been involved in a very particular area of NCP, they recently, just a few months ago, I think in November of 2017, inherited the responsibility for global synchronization of counter-WMD activities, which in my opinion was a good decision by DoD because SOCOM has been very successful doing the same kind of thing for counterterrorism in general. So here representing SOCOM is Wendon Smith. She is the Senior Policy Advisor for Counter-WMD directly to the Commander of SOCOM, and she's also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-WMD. So what I'm going to do here in the opening comments is to kind of set the stage. What are we talking about? What is nuclear counterproliferation? I want to kind of frame the discussion for our follow-on speakers. I want to put some questions on the table that hopefully they will address, as well as you all can address during a Q&A. And this is a large area, so the focus will certainly end up being along the lines of what an NNSA looks at in this area, as well as SOCOM. So, next slide. What you see on the screen here are the basic questions that I want to talk about and I want the entire workshop to address. The first question, what is it, is really important because, as I mentioned earlier, there is confusion and really not a full understanding of what NCP is. So I'm going to define it and then contrast it with nonproliferation. We'll spend some time talking about the threat. We'll do that in the form of some graphics showing some trend lines, as well as a video I have embedded in this talk. What is our national strategy? If you recall from the write-up to the workshop, we talked about something called the nuclear deterrence triangle. And that triangle has had traditionally two sides for sure: strategic nuclear deterrence as well as non-proliferation. And the question we posed in the write-up is, should counterproliferation be that third side of the triangle? So we'll talk about that as well. And then finally, towards the end, I'll describe NCP in terms of its technical and operational components. And from that, hopefully the panel members can talk about the technical challenges that exist within those components. So let's move forward. All right, what we're looking at here is a definition of counterproliferation. Let me walk through it. A set of interrelated activities designed to defeat a key phrase, the development and use of nuclear weapons and improvised nuclear and radiological activity devices by state proliferators and non-state actors, both of them, in, another key phrase, a non-cooperative environment. Now let me bring up next the non-proliferation definition in order to contrast it with counterproliferation. So non-pro is what we call the set of coordinated activities designed to limit, as opposed to defeat, the spread of nuclear technology, materials, and expertise, primarily in cooperative environments, versus non-cooperative environments in counterproliferation. So I think when you define these areas in those terms, you can see a distinct difference between the two. And again, when you talk to folks who haven't seen these definitions, they tend to just lump these things in together. But when you separate out the environments in which they operate, non-cooperative and cooperative, it becomes very clear. All right, let's now take a look at nuclear threat trends. What I have here is a graphic. Along the horizontal bottom axis is time, decades from the 1940s all the way up to this decade. And along the vertical axis, I have something called the nuclear threat. And this is a subjective measurement. We don't have units assigned to it. But I think it'll become clear and make sense to you as we walk through this graphic and I build a number of lines on it. So what we're looking at here is both a small blue portion where we're talking about Germany in World War II, obviously the advent of nuclear weapons. But then the white line is the Soviet Union and Russia. And what we're saying here is that soon after World War II, after we employed 2 nuclear weapons in World War II, the Soviets quickly came on board, an aggressive program, and they did testing. Joe 1 you see here, as well as Joe 4, the hydrogen bomb test. And I think most people would agree that probably the highest point of the entire nuclear threat environment was probably around the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then for the next 50 years or so, there was clearly a trend downward due to lots of agreements between us and the Soviet Union. So we have the START Treaty, we have the CBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and so we saw the threat being reduced. So we see this downward trend continuing all the way up into this decade, and even the New START agreement that's fairly recent. But then you'll notice a dotted line there at the very end that begins with around this time period. Big discussions at the Deterrence Summit later today and tomorrow concerning the Nuclear Posture Review that was just released within the last couple weeks. As described in the Nuclear Posture Review, there is a sense among many that Russia has turned this trend from down to up due to a number of activities involving their nuclear capability. So let's go ahead to the next slide and add state proliferation. And we show this here in green. And you could see that the first milestone, if you will, that I'm showing is China's first test back in the mid-60s. Now we see a green trend line leading up to that. As you can imagine, such a test just doesn't come out of the blue. They had to have been thinking about it, planning it, and preparing for it for quite some time, so that green trend line leading up to that test makes sense. But then about a decade later, we have India doing their first test. Then you proceed along, and suddenly we have the fall of the Soviet Union, and great concern at the time, legitimately so, with the security of special nuclear material and a lot of the assets of the former Soviet Union. And so for at least a period of time, these materials were not considered to be secure, and so we show a vertical jump in the nuclear threat. Then once that's secured, we see a downward trend. And then we see Pakistan. Pakistan in the 1990s, they actually did a test involving, I believe, 5 different detonations, but that was a surprise to most of the world. And then, more recently, we had, in 2003, North Korea withdrew from the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then 3 years later, in 2006, they tested their first bomb. And then really there's been a number of activities within the last 10 years. So we had the Iran nuclear agreement. Now, some of you may question how I show this vertical bump up in terms of the nuclear threat for the Iranian agreement. There's controversy there. Obviously, the Obama administration intended to reduce the threat, but so we could probably change that trend up or down slightly. But once you go beyond that, then you see last year in 2017 alone, I believe that North Korea did 16 ballistic missile tests. And so they now have the capability, it's widely believed, to strike Japan, and are not that far away from being able to strike the United States and Hawaii. And we see that trend continuing up with that dotted line. So let's move to the last line, and this is the red line that is capturing the activities and progress, if you will, of non-state actors, including terrorists. And so you see this long, gradual increase up until we see the AQCon design proliferation. That, as you'll hear in the video, was significant. It was at that point in time that knowledge that had been unknown to most of the world was suddenly being sold on the market, and countries like Libya and North Korea purchased this information and began working on their own capabilities. Then the trend continued to increase. Some of you may remember that there was a concern about suitcase nukes. In fact, some former senior Russian military folks expressed concern that some of these allegedly suitcase nukes had gotten out, that they were unaccounted for. I believe there was even a 60-minute interview with one of these former Russian generals, and even some U.S. congressmen expressed concern. Then further along the line, we're looking at 9/11. Now, 9/11 clearly didn't involve any nuclear employment, but we need to include it here because as you see that next milestone, Al-Qaeda has made it very clear that they want to obtain a nuclear weapon. And there's no doubt in most people's minds that if they had had one and they could have used it during 9/11, they would have. I think they call it a holy duty that their members seek out nuclear expertise because they want to have a device. And then moving along, we see the development of ISIS, and I'm showing a non-nuclear activity here involving both Syria and ISIS and the employment of chemical weapons. Now I include that here because I think what it shows is how emboldened both a state and a non-state actor were and are, because these activities are continuing today. They are less fearful of employing weapons of mass destruction in general, and the pressure that the international community has traditionally put on such activities seems to be waning. And so I think it's easy to draw the conclusion that if they had nuclear weapons, they might be more emboldened to employ them as well. So if we step back from this graphic and look, you can see the large nation nuclear threat, in this case Soviet Union and Russia, decreasing mostly over the last 50 years. But at the same time, you see state proliferation increasing, the green line, as well as non-state actor increase in trends. Now, we're going to come back to this graphic, but what I want to do is pause and watch a video. This is a short clip from an NTI Nuclear Threat Initiative documentary. And the larger documentary addresses, the subject of it is nuclear tipping point. And we will see and hear from several speakers. One here is Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. You'll also hear from Secretary of State Schultz, former Secretary of Defense Perry, as well as former Senator Sam Nunn. And in it, they talk about the increasing threat, nuclear threat. And the point of the nuclear tipping point is that they believe that, along with as our graphic showed, that the threat from the large nuclear states, Russia and now China, has actually decreased enough that the real threat, the more likely threat, is coming from the state proliferators and the non-state actors. And because of that, there needs to be a change in the U.S. strategy and the way we view this problem and the way we attack this problem. So let me add here that while this video is already 8 years old, perhaps a little dated, in my opinion, I think it's worthwhile looking at, because even if we were not at a nuclear tipping point back in 2010, the trends that these gentlemen predicted have occurred, continue to occur, as we saw in the graphic. And so perhaps we can discuss during the Q&A period, were we at a tipping point back in 2010? Are we at one today? Or is it still in front of us? So let's go ahead and take a look at this video.
And if the existing nuclear countries cannot develop some restraints among themselves, in other words, if nothing fundamental changes, then I would expect that a use of nuclear weapons in some 10-year period is very possible.
The world has changed since the end of the Cold War. More countries have nuclear weapons and others are attempting to develop nuclear weapons capabilities. The world needs energy, and that has many countries understandably turning to nuclear power, which, unless safely and securely managed, could also spread sensitive technologies to make the materials essential to a nuclear bomb. The simple fact is, we need new strategies to deal with today's nuclear threats.
If you can learn how to enrich fuel for a nuclear power plant, you've learned how to enrich it for a weapon.
And we have seen already in a country like Pakistan, which is a reasonably well-developed country, that a whole system of proliferation was either possible or tolerated that spread nuclear technology to Libya, North Korea, and some other rogue states.
As nations like Iran and Pakistan, North Korea get nuclear bombs, then the probability increases that one or more of those bombs will fall into the hands of a terror group.
The classical notion of deterrence was that there were some consequences before which aggressors and evildoers would recoil. In a world of suicide bombers, that calculation doesn't operate in any comparable way.
And if you think of the people who are doing suicide attacks, and people like that get a nuclear weapon, they are almost by definition not deterrable. And if you have terrorists get something, then you don't even know the return address. So I think it's a very dangerous moment.
The danger is not simply more nations with nuclear weapons, but that material to make a bomb is scattered around the world. A lot of potential sources for terrorists.
No terror group that we are aware of, even if they're well-financed and well-organized, can build a nuclear weapon from scratch. But if they got the fissile material, through another nation, either by buying or stealing it, if they got the right kind of fissile material, then it's not simple to build a nuclear weapon, but it is feasible.
Plans for such a device were found on computers that were part of the AQ Khan smuggling ring, a gang that we know sold nuclear weapons information and equipment to Libya, Iran, North Korea, and possibly other nations or terrorist groups. We don't know who might have those plans. We do know that nuclear technology, closely guarded during the Cold War, has gradually seeped into the global information database. The International Atomic Energy Agency says there have been more than 1,300 nuclear smuggling incidents since 1993, nearly 20 of which have involved the transfer of weapons-usable material. The director of the agency has sounded the alarm, warning that the possibility of terrorists obtaining nuclear or other radioactive material remains a grave threat, and that sometimes material is found that had not been reported missing.
We know several things. We know that the know-how in terms of how to make a crude weapon has exploded over the last 10, 15 years. So the availability of information about the science required to make a weapon is out there now. Not a piece of cake, but doable. The second thing we know is the nuclear material, highly enriched uranium, plutonium is spread all over the world. And without the material, you can't make a weapon. And the third thing we know is the terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, but not limited to Al-Qaeda, are seeking this nuclear material and would like to make a weapon. They've said so, and I believe them.
All right, let's revisit the graphic that I showed before the video. What you're looking at here is a blow-up of the last 25 years. And I put a circle around really the last decade or so because, as we're all very familiar, there have been many activities involving state proliferators, particularly North Korea, as well as the crisis in the Mideast with ISIS and continuing activities of Al-Qaeda. And so if we go back to the time frame of this video where these gentlemen thought we were already at a nuclear tipping point, my graphic, at least with the green line crossing the white line, would seem to support that contention. My graphic, however, shows that it wasn't until later, until more recently, that the threat from the non-state actors has perhaps crossed the threshold associated with the larger nuclear threat from Russia. But I guess, it really doesn't matter where the tipping point or when it occurred, because in reality, you never know about tipping points until you go forward. We might have to go forward 10 or 20 years, and at that point we could look back and say there truly was a tipping point at that time. But clearly there's a lot going on here, and whether we're at a tipping point or inflection point today or not, we're getting pretty close. And I think the conclusions that these gentlemen drew about us having to take a closer look at our long-standing traditional nuclear deterrence strategy is very relevant. Next slide. What I'm going to show here are three assessments from the current administration and the previous two. And I think you'll agree with me that the words of the presidents, Bush and Obama, and then from the most recent national security strategy, do reinforce the notion that the times have changed. So back in 2002, President Bush said the following: "The gravest danger our nation faces lies at the crossroads of radicalism and technology. Our enemies have openly declared that they are seeking weapons of mass destruction, and evidence indicates that they are doing so with determination." Now, President Bush here is talking about weapons of mass destruction at large, which of course include nuclear weapons. Next slide. Here, President Obama says in 2010, the greatest threat to U.S. and global security is no longer a nuclear exchange between nations, meaning large nations, in particular Russia and the U.S. and China, but nuclear terrorism by violent extremists and nuclear proliferation to an increasing number of states. And finally, next slide. The most recent national security strategy, just published last year, The danger from hostile state and non-state actors who are trying to acquire nuclear, chemical, radiological, and biological weapons is increasing. Terrorist groups continue to pursue WMD-related activities. So the three administrations at the highest levels of our government all confirm the trends that we showed earlier. Next slide. What I want to do here is describe in a simple graphic, which I'm going to build, the nuclear threat space involving these three groups: the large nuclear states, the smaller hostile states, and the non-state actors. And then I want to overlay that with the activities that our government is involved in that are intended to deter the threat from these three groups. So let's build a slide. Looking at the top of the red portion of the slide, you'll see a white arrow pointing both ways, and I call this the threat continuum. So on the left side, I say that on the left side you have least likely or the lower threat probability of a nuclear event being relatively low as compared to moving to the right where it becomes increasingly more likely. Now I'll come back to the consequences bullets there, but the yellow box below this identifies the large nuclear states on the left, just below the least likely probability, and then the increasing probability as we move to the right on the threat continuum occurs with the small nuclear states and the non-state actors. Now the point of the higher consequences and variable consequences is as follows. Clearly, while the probability may be low that there will be a nuclear exchange between the U.S. and Russia and perhaps even China, if it were to occur, the consequences are huge. They're catastrophic. Not just kinetically, but the whole global environment would change. On the right side, where it's more likely, in my opinion and many others, that we're going to have a nuclear event involving a small hostile nuclear state or a non-state actor, the consequences are variable. Certainly kinetically, there'll be a whole lot less because the likelihood is that one or maybe a couple of bombs would be employed, so kinetically the damage wouldn't be anywhere near the exchange between the U.S. and Russia. But the consequences extend beyond kinetics, and it would still be a huge changing event in the global environment, but the consequences would really vary. Now we begin to overlay the efforts that are part of the U.S.'s strategy, deterrent strategy. So this big brown ellipse labeled strategic deterrence or strategic nuclear deterrence is what we have traditionally done. And what I mean by that, and in fact, there are many who agree that this is a term that probably needs to be changed because it's been around since the end of World War II, and it applies to our triad and the weapons, the platforms, the infrastructure, everything associated with our strategic nuclear assets, okay? They are clearly intended and have done a wonderful job of deterring Russia and now China because the fear on all sides of the tremendous catastrophic damage that would be done if we got in a war. So that has had its place and it's done its job. Clearly, the capability that we have here also deters small hostile states. Now you'll notice I left a little bit of space there on the small hostile states, indicating that I don't believe that they're completely deterred. Not that they would launch a missile at us under the threat of us retaliating with a significant response, but the small hostile states have ways potentially of covertly delivering a weapon against us, and perhaps even doing that through non-state actors. So there's purposely drawn a big ellipse. So let's now build this further. I want to add missile defense here, and then I'm going to take it off here in the ensuing slides, because you all know that there's much more to deterring a nuclear threat than just strategic deterrence, and as we'll see, non-pro and counter-pro. Missile defense and other areas like space and cyber all play roles. I mean, it's a whole of government effort. But I just want to put missile defense up here shortly because We can talk about what it deters. Now, it deters primarily the small states. And why is that? Because the missile defense capability that we have is not huge. It can shoot down a limited number of missiles fired at us, which small hostile states only have. It clearly is not a deterrent against Russia or China, despite what they may say in the political arena, but it wouldn't deter them because they could overwhelm that system if they chose to do so. So missile defense clearly targets hostile nuclear states, small ones, but doesn't have any effect on non-state actors. Wouldn't, because they're not going to be firing missiles at us, more likely. They're going to be delivering a single bomb covertly, and so they're not concerned about missile defense. So we'll go ahead and take this off, and then we'll add non-proliferation. Again, remember my definition for non-proliferation. It's those activities designed to limit the spread of nuclear expertise and material and so on and so forth in cooperative environments. So we have detectors in ports in other countries that are looking for nuclear, looking for radiation signals and so on and so forth. And so non-proliferation has been wildly successful in terms of limiting the spread of nuclear material, special nuclear material. And so it prevents, or at least helps deter further spread of nuclear weapon states, small ones developing, as well as it keeps the material out of the hands of non-state actors. And so it's been very effective, certainly since 9/11 and even during the 1990s. And I would say that non-proliferation is an area that was very much emphasized under the Obama administration. But let's go ahead and add the last portion of my slide. So what we've done here, let me address the blue ellipse, the counterterrorism one. I want to put that here because counterterrorism, we're all very familiar with, is targeted at primarily non-state actors. And I include it here because it shows the relationship between counterproliferation and counterterrorism. Counterproliferation includes, if you recall, two elements that it deters: the small states and non-state actors. And that black portion of counterproliferation that sits inside the counterterrorism ellipse is what really should be called NCT, nuclear counterterrorism. NCT is a subset of the larger counterterrorism set of activities. Now I'll ding Jay Tilden here a little bit, who's going to be up on the panel. If you recall, his title addresses NCP/NCT. But to me, that's sort of a redundant title for his organization because NCT is a subset of NCP. So the complete circle there, the black circle or ellipse called counterproliferation, as you can see, addresses the small states and the non-state actors. So definitions, I think, are important, and particularly here, as this graphic shows, it shows the difference between non-pro and counter-pro. Let me close this slide by reading to you a statement that comes from what was called America's Strategic Posture, a final report to the Congressional Commission on Strategic Posture of the United States. And it was written, this report was authored by former Secretary of Defense William Perry, who we saw earlier in the video, along with former Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger. They said, since non-proliferation does not always succeed, and deterrence, and what they mean is strategic nuclear deterrence, is sometimes unreliable, the overall strategy must be supplemented with additional steps to prevent nuclear proliferation and terrorism and protect ourselves from its consequences. So what they're saying is, in relation to this graphic, is that while strategic nuclear deterrence has been very, very successful, nobody believes for one moment that it will necessarily always deter large and small states. And while also non-proliferation has been very, very successful, to think one moment that it will always prevent the spread of small amounts of nuclear material or even the loss of a full nuclear weapon, to think that it will be 100% perfect is not realistic. And so therefore, there has to be a strong capability, counterproliferation, a proactive offensive, if you will, set of capabilities that when those other two deterrence elements fail, this element is prepared to be put in place. And so, as you can see, we're leading towards that nuclear deterrence triangle where I'm attempting to make the case that counterproliferation is a necessary aspect of our strategic deterrence, while it may not be recognized so in our government. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, what I want to do here is shift for the moment and look a little deeper into nuclear counterproliferation. I defined it earlier and referred to that definition, but let's take a look at some of the components and get a feel for what actually takes place, the activities associated with nuclear counterproliferation. This graphic is taken directly from Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Matters. It comes from the Nuclear Matters Handbook. It's been around for a long time, and it describes what's called the nuclear event pathway. And these 5 steps represent activities that must occur for either a small state or a non-state actor to build a bomb and actually deliver it somewhere. So over on the left, they have to come to the decision that they want to do this. So they have to be motivated. It's not an easy decision. It's not a simple decision. So they have to come to that conclusion, and then they have to start the planning process. If you remember trend lines from earlier in my graphic, you show those long red trend lines that eventually led, for example, to China's first test. A lot of motivation and planning is part of that slow trend. The next step is they've got to acquire material. They've got to get the special nuclear material. Without that, it doesn't they can't build a bomb. That is the area that non-proliferation activities have been wildly successful at, is securing that material in places like the former Soviet Union and other places to prevent it from leaking out into terrorists and other states' hands. But again, not perfect. Then once they get the material, they've got to be able to actually design and build an entire bomb. That is becoming increasingly easier because the information on how to do this, at least in terms of simple devices, is on the internet. It's well known. So it is not difficult to produce, as Senator Sam Nunn said earlier in the video, to produce a weapon. And if they have the material, they've got everything they need. And then, of course, what's not simple is they've got to be able to store this weapon and be able to move it discreetly. And that is not easy, especially given the non-proliferation detection and monitoring that takes place around the world. And then finally, they have to get it on the target of choice. So it's agreed that these are the general steps. So what we can do, or what has been done, and what I'll show you the design that we had when I was the program director for nuclear counterproliferation, the various activities that could be used to counter these steps. So let's go ahead and build this slide. All right, on this slide, what I have at the very top is the graphic you just saw in the previous slide. I shrunk it down, and I have an arrow pointing from it down to the larger black arrow, which is also called nuclear event pathway. I'm just doing this because I didn't want to make this graphic too complicated. But that black line with the black circle on the left and the arrow all the way out on the right does represent those 5 activities as part of nuclear event pathway. Now, there's 2 milestones shown on this graphic. The yellow gold box represents the distinct point at which the state or the non-state actor has a legitimate, credible capability. They actually have a bomb, which they may have bought from somebody else, they may have built themselves, or even have finally obtained the special nuclear material. And in Hollywood terms, this is when the clock starts ticking. Because now, if they reach this point, they obviously have an intent to use it. And so now it's a matter of time before they move this device or devices to the point at which they want to detonate it. Okay? And then the next milestone, as you see over there, is the nuclear explosion, or what we call the boom. Now you'll hear the expression to the right of boom and to the left of boom. To the right of boom are post-detonation activities that have to take place, as we'll talk about shortly. And to the left of boom are all those activities that we're involved in to prevent the boom from ever occurring. Now below that black line are what we call lines of effort. And these are both operational and R&D efforts. that have to take place in order to perform the nuclear counterproliferation mission. So let's look at the first one, called Identify and Predict. This is really a set of activities designed to characterize and assess the entire nuclear design and production threat space through intelligent analysis and fusion of intelligence with nuclear weapons subject matter expertise. It includes the development and maintenance of threat assessments, empirical analysis of intelligence, and the use of predictive capabilities to identify indicators and warnings of nuclear proliferation and terrorist activities. So as you can see, this line of effort extends the full length of the nuclear event pathway. It needs to continually occur, before a boom and after a boom. Line of effort number 2 also extends the full length of the nuclear event pathway, monitor and detect. This is intended to observe and monitor and expose activities associated with the development, production, and employment of nuclear weapons by state proliferators and non-state actors. Now we move into what I call the interdiction LOEs, both the upstream defeat and the nuclear WMD defeat. Upstream defeat refers to that portion of the nuclear event pathway to the left of that yellow gold box. And the further you move to the left, we call that moving upstream, or we say moving to the left. And those are essentially largely covert, perhaps overt, but largely covert activities that are intended to defeat or deter or slow down those nuclear event pathways that the bad guys are intended on doing. And then should the upstream defeat activities not be successful, and the state proliferator, non-state actor actually develops a capability and has a nuclear device, and the clock is ticking, we have to be able to defeat that. If that device is intended to be put in Times Square, then we've got to either intercept it before it gets there or diffuse it before it takes off in Times Square. And then finally, the last LOE is what we call attribution. And attribution refers to a combination of nuclear forensics, examining the data associated with radiological readings associated with the boom of a nuclear weapon, and combining that with legal evidence, law enforcement evidence, to hopefully legally attribute that device to a particular actor, whether it's a particular country or a particular non-state actor. And so we can then take actions and be sure of who the perpetrator is. So I would argue that those are the 5 main efforts associated with nuclear counterproliferation. They involve both operational capabilities and science and technology, R&D activities. When we showed this to the director of Los Alamos, he immediately recognized that the role of Los Alamos and other S&T organizations is to work way to the left, develop capabilities that just stops the progress of a potential nuclear perpetrator early on in the process, because frankly we never want to get to that window where the device already exists and it's being deployed, because that's not a good proposition. Next slide. All right, I've talked about the nuclear triangle continually throughout this talk, and it was also in the write-up. So here we're looking at that triangle. So down at the bottom, clearly strategic deterrence, nuclear deterrence, has been the mainstay of our nuclear deterrence policy and strategy in the U.S. Non-proliferation is huge. Recall the green ellipse. That was much larger than the counterproliferation ellipse. But there's still a question mark as to whether counterproliferation is viewed and is considered, or should be considered, the third element of our triangle. And that is what we'll talk about here later after my talk. Panel members hopefully will discuss it, and when we open it up for Q&A, I will open it up to the larger audience and we'll talk about this. Obviously, from everything that I've said at this point, in my opinion, it should be part of our strategy and should be explicitly recognized as such. All right, next slide. The next two slides are meant to reinforce the notion that counterproliferation does not, in fact, receive the same kind of priority as the other two elements. And when I say that, in this particular case, we're going to look at funding. So here is NNSA's fiscal year 18 budget request. The top gray portion, called weapons activities, which is the support to strategic deterrence, the weapons portion of strategic deterrence, you'll see that it represents 80% or $10.2 billion of NNSA's budget. The non-proliferation portion of NNSA's budget represents over 14% and $1.5 billion. So at this point in time, you don't even see counterproliferation, because counterproliferation is not high enough in the organization to warrant its own line item. As Jay Tilden will have to admit, at least privately, while on an org chart he sits up there at the same level as the directors of weapons activity, the administrators, and non-proliferation, in fact he doesn't. He's a rung down, and his budget is in fact drawn out of the nuclear non-proliferation budget. So next slide. So if you dig into NNSA's budget, you will find two elements called, one nuclear counterterrorism and the other one incident response. And in it you will see a 2.5% portion devoted to those two missions, which are essential elements of nuclear counterproliferation. Now, for those of you who are doing the math and saying the percentages don't add up to 100%, I'm not showing the remaining 2.5% approximately that has to do with other things that NNSA has to budget that aren't related directly to these three mission areas. Also, let me point out, just to be fair, you see those dotted lines, one in the green area and one in the gray area. They represent portions of those areas that are paid for by those budgets but are in fact being used to support the NCP mission. So to give you an example, at Los Alamos, the weapons program has a big budget, the largest budget there, and they have a number of facilities and a number of weapons scientists that are devoted at times to the NCP mission. And so to be fair, there probably is something greater than 2.5% of the NSA budget being devoted to this mission set, but I don't believe it even reaches 5%. It's down low. Now, so what? What does that mean? Well, I'm not sure what the overall breakout should be among weapons activities, non-pro and counter-pro. But given the threat space that we showed and the administration's admitting that the more likely threat today is coming from the non-state actors and the state actors, not from Russia and China, you put those two things together and you say, I don't know what the right breakout is, but my sense is this is not the right breakout. This would imply that we are not devoting the kind of resources and giving this mission area the kind of priority that I believe, and others do, it deserves. Well, let me close then with one slide, as I'm showing here. And this is an overall assessment provided by the National Defense University when the new administration came on board by John Caves. He says, WMD posed diverse, complex, and enduring challenges for U.S. and international security. The challenges are no longer predominantly about preventing proliferation, which is the non-proliferation set of activities. They are again increasingly about deterring and responding or defeating the use of WMD. So clearly he's saying here that non-proliferation has probably reached its pinnacle. The activities that are taking place are probably pretty much about everything that we can do. And hopefully they'll continue to be successful. But the reality is that proliferation's increasing, and so we better up our capability on the counterproliferation side of the house. Finally, John says we need to look for ways to broaden and deepen interagency contributions to counter-WMD operations. Clearly, this is a whole-of-government effort. And Wendon will perhaps talk to that because SOCOM has inherited that responsibility for synchronizing these efforts. But John goes on to say, and specifically cite the Department of Energy's NNSA. He believes, as I do, that there's more that these weapons laboratories and NNSA could be doing in the area of nuclear counterproliferation. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to continuing discussions on this subject.